So in this video we'll talk about vulnerabilities and exploits. A vulnerability is a flaw in the system, and they are not put there on purpose most of the times, they're just put there by accident. And an exploit will abuse that vulnerability to, for example, gather information or take over a system. So a vulnerability in cybersecurity is a weakness or flaw in the system, and an attacker can exploit that weakness, usually with a program, to gain unauthorized information and to take over the system. Now, there are many definitions for vulnerabilities. However, we'll just keep it simple and say vulnerability is a flaw in the software, and an exploit is a program that takes advantage of that vulnerability. Vulnerabilities can be categorized in several categories. For example, operating system vulnerabilities. So these are like Windows vulnerabilities or macOS vulnerabilities. They are really on the operating system level. There's misconfiguration-based vulnerabilities. So these vulnerabilities come from incorrectly configured application or service. There's weak credentials. So for example, weak passwords like admin, or maybe the administrator is still using the default passwords. So those kind of vulnerabilities exist. Then there's application vulnerabilities. So within any software, for example, a web server or mail server, sometimes programmers make mistakes, and the program has unintended flaws called vulnerabilities, and an exploit program can then take advantage of that vulnerability and take over the system. And finally, there's of course the human factor vulnerabilities, like humans opening an email that is designed to trick the person into giving their passwords. So different kind of vulnerabilities. Now, in this video, we'll mostly talk about operating system and application vulnerabilities, so software level vulnerabilities. In this video, we won't really get into misconfigurations or weak passwords or stuff like that. Now, in order to take advantage of vulnerabilities in software, we use exploits. Exploits are programs that take advantage of the vulnerabilities. And there exist many exploits on the internet. One collection of that is the exploit DB. So if I open a web browser, I had already opened one, we can go to exploit-db.com, and this is a resource that you as a hacker can use. So exploit DB contains a list of software and exploits for that software. All kinds of software and exploits. And so it's a very useful tool when you are hacking. So it's a default website. You'll see that there's different software here. Now you can search for a specific software. For example, the WordPress is a popular blogging software. And you'll see there's all kind of exploits for plugins. And you'll see that there's 92 pages here. So you can browse through the pages and see if different plugins have vulnerabilities or which have, and exploits for them. So if I click on this, for example, the top one here, it says remote code execution. So let's take a look at that. And they'll tell you that this is remote code execution. And it's just one of the exploits. You'll see this is the code for the exploit. And you can download it if you want. So that's the exploit code that takes advantage of the vulnerability. And this works for many different software. So let's say this vulnerability local file read with this kind of plugin. So it's very simple exploits. You can download the code, and then you would be able to run it. Now, local file reading, of course, is a very bad idea, because in the worst case, they can just read your password file and gain access to your server, to your computer. So the exploit DB lets you search for applications, and it's not just software, you can also search for operating system. For example, we can search for Windows, and we'll see exploits for Windows. We might search for Mac. Okay, I don't see any for Mac here. So some stuff for Mac OS, for Linux, and also like for more general application level. So for example, if I search for mail, you'll see some mail related software, and you can search for whichever software you want that you think the target might be running, and see if you can find exploits for that specific software. Another database is the National Vulnerability Database. Now this database doesn't have the exploits, so it is less interesting as a hacker, unless you want to develop those exploits yourself. So you'll see in this database the vulnerabilities are started with CVE, which is short for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. And they always have a year and a number. So for example, there's the famous WannaCry vulnerability that was all over the news. And we can search for that. So if I type for WannaCry, I don't see it. Okay, but for any kind of software, there's vulnerabilities, and this is just like the vulnerability database, but it doesn't contain any exploits on this website, so it's less interesting. You'll see, for example, here we have a vulnerability for WordPress, and it will tell you some information, but there's no exploit code. So ExploitDB is the one that you're interested in, because for whatever software, it also contains exploit code. So for example, I click this one, and you see we can download the exploit code and try to exploit that software. So let me show you how to find a vulnerability for some software. So we'll look at a software called Apache Tomcat, and the victim is running version 9.0.70. So we'll type Apache Tomcat, which is the software that they're running, and they are running version 9.0.17. So sometimes those flaws get solved by the programmer, and the user updates, so then the software is no longer vulnerable. So it's always a cat and mouse game between the vulnerabilities and the exploits. So let me just search for Tomcat or Tomcat 9.0, and you'll see some vulnerabilities here for Tomcat version 9.0.0 and others, and you can click on any of them, and you'll see, for example, this exploit is for cross-site scripting. We can download the exploit, and it tells you how to run the exploit. Sometimes it's the exploit code itself.